about 30 years ago, in the early stages of the Republic campaign, I phoned up Australians for Constitutional Monarchy, a newly formed organisation, in their grace and favour office. Wealthy monarchists would give them an office in a building which was to be demolished for nothing, and that was very good. I went there and I had a talk to Tony Abbott, who was the newly appointed executive director, and then we went to lunch and we walked down the street, and you may have noticed that Tony Abbott has a distinctive way of walking, which can only be described as masculine. It, I think, sends the signal, don't mess with me. When you're walking with somebody in the street, you have to slow down or speed up and keep at the same speed as the other person. You tend to walk a bit like them. And that made me think of something in a Groucho Marx film. Because there was a scene in a Groucho Marx film where he goes into a restaurant and the head waiter, who's rather fair, says, walk this way. And Groucho Marx says, if I walked that way, I'd be arrested. And that's what I thought as I was going down the street. Tony has played a special role in keeping away what was called the Republic, the politicians' republic. He was the strongest of all of the handful of MPs who were prepared to put their heads over the parapet. There weren't many, and he was the strongest of them all. The others kept quiet despite their oaths. And I was reminded in the last election, you may have noticed there was a debate over whether the opposition was putting their message to the people. It's pointed out that in 2013, Tony Abbott, who is a master of the English language, who writes wonderfully and speaks very well, reduced the message of the opposition to 3 short phrases: stop the boats, axe the tax, and end the waste. And that was magnificent because it told 1,000 words, and he won that election. And like a certain American president, John, like a certain American president, he does what he said he would do, and that's what he did when he was in office. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to invite the 28th Prime Minister, Tony Abbott.
Well, David, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I'm delighted to pay tribute to your wonderful work heading up Australians for Constitutional Monarchy these last couple of decades. As for my peculiar gait, I did not model myself on Groucho Marx, more on John Wayne. And look, it's terrific to be following Greg Copley. I think it's wonderful that America's foremost strategist should not only be an Australian, but also a strong supporter of constitutional monarchy. And you obviously have a job to do of restoration in the United States, and may it go well. I'm pleased that Greg's latest book, The Noble State, is available for purchase, and I think it's great that we've got the author himself to talk about it. It's a wonderful celebration of the idea of monarchy, because monarchy, essentially a locus of authority that is above and beyond politics, speaks to something deep in our human nature. The need for ceremony, ritual, continuity. I think we saw in the period of mourning for the late Queen Elizabeth a global sense of yearning for the values that she represented. She was for 70 years an exemplar of duty and service, and people who are not familiar with these concepts nevertheless resonated with the person who had so well exemplified them. And the great thing about a hereditary monarchy is that in one family you have people who are born and bred to this life of duty and service. Obviously, not all members of royal families take their familial obligations seriously, but nevertheless, I think we can be pretty clear that King Charles is very much his mother's son, and whatever occasional exuberances he might have displayed as Prince of Wales, he's very much followed his mother's pattern as king. And here in Australia, we have the British Crown, which we have thoroughly Australianised, represented in this country by someone who is a distinguished Australian above and beyond politics, a Governor-General appointed like a judge as opposed to a president chosen like a politician. So I think, Greg, that your book is a wonderful, almost rhapsodic evocation of the ongoing strengths of monarchy as a system of government. Interestingly, for societies which are still, in so many respects, traditional, clannish, even feudal, monarchy works particularly well and republics work particularly badly. If you look, for instance, at the Middle East, attempts at creating democratic and inverted republics have invariably been characterised by one man, one vote, once. All of the Middle Eastern republics have degenerated into some form of tyranny, either personal tyranny or more often Islamist tyranny. Whereas if you look around the Middle East, it is the monarchies which have enjoyed a considerable degree of success, whether it be the Moroccan monarchy, the Jordanian monarchy, which have produced relatively decent and humane societies without the benefit of the untold riches of oil. If you look at the Gulf states or Saudi Arabia, there has at least been a degree of civility, not so much civility, a degree of stability, and increasingly in at least some of the Gulf states, such as the UAE, a degree of civility as well as stability. Which brings me to the topic of regime change. Now, the fundamental problem with the two Western-driven attempts at regime change in recent decades has been that there has been no real plan for what comes next. I can remember a discussion inside the Howard government back in 2003 where it had become clear that there was to be an attempt to remove the Saddam Hussein regime, and where it had become clear that Australia would be involved in a military capacity. The question was put, well, we've got a plan for the war, what's the plan for the peace? And I regret to say that no one around that table was able to come up with a plan for the peace. What in fact happened was that the incoming United States plenipotentiary immediately abolished the Iraqi army, which meant that there was 500,000 unemployed men with guns, and immediately abolished and disbanded the Ba'athist public service, which meant that no one knew how anything worked, and chaos ensued. By contrast, had the Americans been prepared to look at the re-establishment of the Iraqi monarchy, which had given Iraq a degree of stability for several decades, after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, it could have been much different. Likewise, in Afghanistan, after the removal of the Taliban regime in 2001, the lawyer jirga that was assembled petitioned the then American victors for a return of the king, and I suppose showing the ongoing national neuralgia over George III, the Americans said no, and we all know the result. There was a succession of weak governments, democratic in form but authoritarian in nature, which ultimately were unable to resist the return of the Taliban because they were not able to appeal to the deep instincts of the human heart upon which all successful, lasting administrations must rest. Somewhere in the hearts of citizens or subjects, there has got to be something great that we can identify with, whether it's faith, whether it's family, whether it's country, and it needs a system which somehow speaks to the deep things in our souls if it is to survive. So let's look at some of the countries for which we might think regime change necessary or desirable. If you look at Russia under the Soviets, or indeed in more recent times under President Putin, it's been a relentlessly aggressive state. Whether it was the early attacks on Poland, whether it's been the aggression in Eastern Europe in the Soviet days, whether it's been the more recent attacks under President Putin on so many of the former countries of the Soviet Union which have dared to seek an independent path. And when you look at Russia under the Tsars, yes, it was an expansionist power, but it was expanding eastwards, generally speaking, into areas where arguably the Russians were able to bring something better. If we look west, Russia under the Tsars was more the oppressed than the oppressor. So I think that says something about the nature of Russian governance under a monarchy, even an imperial, even an absolutist monarchy, than it has been subsequently. Likewise, China under the emperors, sure, they saw themselves as the Middle Kingdom. Sure, they saw the role of tributary states as being to tremble and obey, and yet it was hardly an expansionist power in the way China under the Communist Party certainly looks like becoming. Which brings us, of course, to Iran. Now, I'm not a close student of the history of Iran. I'm not a close observer of the Pahlavi family or dynasty, but I certainly think that the people of Iran and the people of the wider world deserve something better than an apocalyptic Islamist dictatorship. I think that there are several very serious threats to the peace and decency of the wider world right now. And I suppose in some respects the Islamist dictatorship in Tehran is the very worst. Russia is a personal dictatorship, a nuclear-armed personal dictatorship, but nevertheless I think that Russian culture, I expect, would exert some restraint even on someone as ruthless as President Putin. China is a party dictatorship, which again exerts some restraint even on the president for life. but an apocalyptic Islamist dictatorship, well, that's a dictatorship that is quite literally in love with death. And if there's one great thing that President Trump has so far done in his second administration, it is joining Israel in doing his best to ensure that this apocalyptic Islamist dictatorship never gets nuclear weapons, because let me give you this little bit of insider information. Climate change is not nearly as big a threat as nuclear war. Nuclear winter strikes me as a much bigger long-term threat to the world than a couple of degrees of global warming.